Page 374 continued. Main characteristics of modern poetry or interwar poetry. 1. Poetry of revolt. Modern poetry is the poetry of revolt. It had to be so. In the 19th century, quote, poetic vocabulary had been drained to its lees, L-E-E-S, unquote, Harold Monroe, M-O-N-R-O. The leaven of romance was already crusting into social philosophy, into democracy and humanitarianism and propaganda. The revolt was not purposeless. The language had to be rejuvenated. The range of poetic subject matter had to be widened. And yet the revolt must travail amidst angry protests and loud wailings. Alfred Noyes, Noyes, spoke of, quote, a general flood of half-educated mediocrity, unquote, stop. Roy Campbell described modern poetry as, quote, an epidemic of intellectual and emotional diarrhea, unquote. Quote, the timidity, the effort, the querulousness, the thinness of ale, A-I-L, the thinness, ale, the best modern poetry, unquote, was due to a, quote, sterile dualism, unquote, in the poet, quote, to a fissure within himself that corresponds to, quote, the fissure between him and his society, stop, unquote, para. It is true much of modern poetry is experimental and as such has only an ephemeral value. Much of its eccentricity is symptomatic of a desire for change and freshness. Tenuity of thought or puerility, P-U-E-R-I-L-I-T-Y, of effort is not the characteristic of any one age. It is of all ages. The so-called lack of scholarship among modern poets and the consequent lack of capacity for sustained thought are a popular fallacy. Abercrombie's lyric impulse is restrained by his intellectuality. Huysman's polished diction owes much to his classical training. Hardy has fused thought with architectural unity even in his shorter lyrics. Bridges had a most thorough knowledge of English prosody and is the author of a poem which has been compared to Lucretius de Rerum Ariarium Natura, Natura. Edmund Blunden is an authority on the 19th century literary history. Erudition is the besetting sin of T.S. Eliot. The versatility of G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc and J.C. Squire, and the deep critical insight of Edward Shanks, John Drinkwater, Sir Henry Newbolt, and Iolo A. Williams are proof enough of the learning and scholarship of the modern poets. Para. 2. Sense of tragedy. The poetry of today has a deeper sense of the tragedy of everyday life. M. Morris Maeterlinck, Maeterlink, spoke of, quote, a tragic element in a life of everyday that is far more real, far more penetrating, far more akin to the true self that is in us than the tragedy that lies in greater adventure, stop, unquote. Page 375, Treasures of the Humble. It is not the remote tragedy of, quote, great adventure, unquote, that moves modern poet. He is not interested in the fate of kings, princes and prelates, and he chooses to sing, quote, of the maimed, of the half and the blind, in the rain and the cold, stop, unquote. The modern poet asks, quote, ... how shall we turn to little things? and listen to the birds and winds and streams, made holy by their dreams, nor feel the heartbreak in the heart of things, unquote. W. W. Gibson in Lament. Life is futile, quote, my good life. And what good has my goodness been to me, ? You show me that, ! Somehow show me that, ! A caterpillar munching a cabbage heart, stop. Stanza with ellipsis mark. A crawling caterpillar eating his life, in a deaf dark, that's my gain of goodness, ! Unquote. Lacillus Abercrombie, The End of the World. Even love that, quote, the budding looks so sweet, unquote, quote, goes crumble into dust, unquote, Cologne. Quote, love is flame to burn out human wheels, love is a flame to set the wheel on fire, love is a flame to cheat men into more, stop, unquote. Mansfield, The Widow of the By Street. Such bitterness, such disenchantment from life, such a poignant, quote, sense of tears in things human, unquote, will not find in the poetry of another age, stop. Para 3. The poetic vision. And yet the modern poet's philosophy is not a philosophy of despair. He does not in all moods sing the psalms, psalm of death. He sees life square and sees it whole. He is afraid neither of the real nor of the romantic. Only he refuses to look at life through the spectacles of romance and to accept that as the only true poetic vision. Under the stress of civilization and social expansion at the cost of individual liberty, it is not possible to treat life as a gala day, stop. Quote, life is a long headache in a noisy street, stop, unquote. To effect an imaginative escape in a world of romance, in an ivory tower of dreams, is, the modern poet thinks, unworthy of him. He feels the thud of life and that mysterious urge to unfold its infinite beauty. He is sincere, painfully sincere. In the words he finds golden sunshine and specks of dust, infinite gloom and stench, triviality and laughter and poor folk, and railway trains and flowers, loves and men and bliss, decay and infinity of things. In this world of a bewildering chaos of things, he makes his quest of beauty. Para. Brooke's unconventionality and iconoclasm in the pursuit of beauty were combined with deep intensity of feeling and rare intellectual vigor. James Elroy Flecker once said, Cologne, quote, it is not the poet's business to save man's soul, but to make it worth saving, stop, unquote. Beauty makes it worth saving. Flecker, I think it should be Flecker, has created in his poetry the splendor of the East. What can excel the gorgeous imagery and the rich sense of color of old ships, the haunting pathos of Yasmin, the warmth, the sensuousness, the fatalism of the golden journey to Samarkand, or the sheer barbaric passion of the Queen's song, ? Quote, had I the power to Midas given of old, to touch a flower and leave the petals gold, I then might touch thy face, delightful boy, and leave a metal grace, stop. A graven joy, stop. Thus would I slay dash. Ah, desperate device, exclamation. The vital day that trembles in thine eyes, stop. And let the red lips close, which sang so well, comma, and drive away the rose to leave a shell, stop, unquote. Para. If Brooke and Flecker were fascinated by the beauty of, quote, the visible and fleeting universe, comma, unquote, Mansfield has moments of deeper insight without any of their deep and intense passion. Quote, for out of love and seeing, beauty herself has being, comma, beauty our queen, semicolon, who with calm spirit guards us, and with dear love rewards us, in court for evergreen, stop, unquote, the eye and the object. Para. Dr. Robert Bridges has attempted in his Testament of Beauty a most ambitious and philosophical interpretation of beauty, beauty in its spiritual and eternal aspect, page 376, quote, what is beauty, question, saith my suffering then, ... Beauty is the highest of all these occult influences, comma, the quality of appearances that through the sense wakeneth spiritual emotion in the mind of man, comma, unquote, book 2. Quote, beauty, comma, the eternal spouse of the wisdom of God, and angel of his presence through all creation, comma, attempteth every mortal child with influences of her divine supremacy, stop, book 4, unquote. Para 4, Science and Modern Poetry. With the advance of science and industry, poetry does not necessarily decline. In spite of its growing mechanization of the world, the modern poet has lost neither his sensitiveness nor his impressionability. The heavy thud of bus traffic, the creaking of tram cars, the rattling noise of railway trains, they may not be good poetically, and yet they have left their impress on modern poetry. Kenneth Ashley's Good Strain at Night is superb for its fusion of realism and romance. John Davidson's Song of the Train is well known, and there is the ballad of a motor bus beginning. Quote, you get in at Ludgate Circus, comma, where in regiments they stand, comma, all throbbing underneath the bridge, comma, and pointing to the Strand. All pageantry with colours, comma, all poetry with words, comma, wait those blazoned motorbuses in their fiercely panting herds, stop, unquote. Para. 5. Concept of nature in the modern poetry. The smoke and the murkiness, the dust and the hurry of the modern world have not destroyed man's joy in nature. Quote, what is this life if, comma, full of care, comma, we have no time to stand and stare, question, unquote. Para. A deep love of and delight in nature are characteristic of modern poetry. It is not the spiritual or emotional life of nature that fascinates the modern poet, but only the simple charm and poetry of her outward manifestation of flowers, birds, wind, countryside. He does not interpret nature or her invisible spirit. He revels in the mere sight of her. He is sensitive and observant, though careless of scientific precision, and he writes of her with a rare freshness and vividness. Bridges has sung of the loveliness of English scenes and scenery of, quote, king-cup and flower-d-lies, lys, upon the marsh to meet, with comfrey, watermint, loose strife and meadow sweet, stop, ... Crowfoot's white galaxy and love's forget-me-nots, ... para. W. H. Davis's nature poems have been compared to the cooing of a cuckoo. He sings, he does not reflect, he has no sense of the mystery of nature, the naivety and freshness of his love of nature, the sheer simplicity and delighted wonder of it make him unique among the nature poets of England. He sings of birds and flowers, of wind and cloud, of April's charms and of May. He simply cannot restrain himself. Quote, when I do hear, single quote, these joyful birds, I cannot sit with my heart dumb, semicolon. I cannot walk among the flowers, but I must help the bees to hum, ... para. The romance and the reality of sea life have found full expression in the poetry of Masefield. His Dabber contains one of the finest descriptions of a sea storm, and while he in his Cargoes and Flecker in his Old Ships have written two of the finest poems on ships, Masefield has known the call of the sea, quote, ... for the call of the running tide is a wild call and a clear call that may not be denied, ... para. 6. Love for animal life in modern poetry. In modern poetry, a new feeling for animal life has developed. It is not the joy of animal life, but its mute suffering that moves the modern poet. He does not write against vivisection or in favor of vegetarianism. All sorts of insects, glowworms, Edward Shanks, moths, Dorothy Wellesley, wasps, Thomas Tomley, semicolon, and creatures like the fish, Rupert Brooke, and snake and kangaroo, D.H. Lawrence, and bat, Lawrence and W. Gibson, and parrot, Gibson, and owls, Walter de la Mare, and domestic animals like dogs, J.C. Squire, and horses, Dorothy Wellesley, all have been treated in modern poetry. Walter de la Mare has written with delicate pathos and compassion on a donkey called Nicholas Nye, Nye. Quote, he munched his thistle, purple and spiked, would sometimes stoop and sigh, and turn to his head, as if he said, quote, poor Nicholas Nye, ! And there in the moonlight, dark and dew, asking not wherefore nor why, would brood like a ghost, and still as a post, old Nicholas Nye, page 377. Para. But deep pity for animal life has found its best expression in the poetry of Ralph Hodgson, Hodgson. In the Bull, he depicts the tragedy of the decay of the animal's youth to the importance of old age when he, quote, from his visionary herds and his splendid yesterday, turns to meet the loathly birds flocking round him upon the skies, waiting for the flesh that dies, Para 7. Religious dogmas in modern poetry. Religious faith held its own chiefly among Roman Catholics such as Mrs. Alice Heynell, Heynell, 1850 to 1922, and it was magnificently expressed in the work of Francis Thompson, 1859 to 1907, who may be looked on as a successor of Coventry Patmore, though his talent was of a very different order. Love in Dian's Lap and Sister Songs were followed by some flamboyant odes, the most famous being The Hound of Heaven. Para. Francis Thompson recalls the metaphysical poets of the 17th century, especially Crashaw, Crashaw. His descriptions are extraordinarily rich and colorful. His eloquence is passionate but sometimes too rhetorical. Para. The strange and obscure poems of the Jesuit Gerard Manley Hopkins, 1844 to 89, a 19th century Southwell, were not conveniently available until 1918, when they attracted readers by virtue of their technical novelty and subtle undercurrents of emotion. Para 8. The humorous poetry. The humorous verse of today covers its very wide range and is as rich as prolific. There are the epigrams of Sir William Watson and Hilaire Belloc, the satire J.C. Squire and Lord Alfred Douglas, the parodies of Sir Owen Seaman and the touching humour of his quote, A Plea for Trigamy, and Time's Revenges, the elfish fun of De la Mare, and the thoughtful fun of Ralph Hodgson, Stupidity Street, the rich humour of Masefield, combining a Chaucerian ease of narrative with a metaphysical twist in the profusion of his similes, as in the quote, thumbnail unquote pictures in his Reynard the Fox, Para 9. Realism in the modern poetry. The Second World War has exercised far-reaching influence on English poetry. Quote, while the First World War had brought about a spiritual idealism in the mind of mankind, the Second World War has given to mankind something higher. Spiritual realism. Purification of soul not through idealistic imagination, but through concrete realism has been the main aim of the modern poets after the horrible war created a terrible and formidable havoc in the sea and in the air. The atom bomb is a horrible and formidable weapon of destruction for the military's commanders, but to the modern poet is a, quote, harbinger of peace, unquote, stop. He is ethically convinced that the havoc wrought by this deadliest weapon of mass destruction would serve as a lesson to humanity and convey to men the futility of war. Reginald Gould, Gould, asserts, quote, sweet was the bomb that killed my son, semicolon. It made him sleep and sleep in peace, semicolon. It made him free from the bars of war, semicolon. Now no more guns, no more bombs, stop, unquote, para. The Second World War has made one more contribution to the modern English poetry. It has given a new theme, march of humanity towards the ultimate goal of universal brotherhood and international cosmopolis. Modern poets condemn aggressive nationalism. They want the world to be founded on the principles of internationalism and cosmopolitan ideals wedded to a creed of global fraternity. The modern poet therefore maintains a sweet and love touch of delicate idealism, Luvaza, L-U-V-A-Z-A, Marquis, M-A-R-K-I, in her poem, quote, Lava Batlana, unquote, after the battle, paints a charming picture of a communist soldier, a prisoner of Korean War who is shortly to be shot dead by the American soldier, recalls to his mind the last bright drop of tear that schemed in the eye of his newly wedded beloved wife when he had left his home to take part in the sacred war against capitalistic imperialism. His eyes too become filled with tears, and then immediately he dries up the tears and says to the American guard, quote, "Thumbs up!" exclamation unquote. Quote, "and little hush!" exclamation, and a sweet face, semicolon. A tear rolled last in her deep blue eyes, semicolon. He shut his eyes, for they were wet, comma. Anon he stood, thumbs, comma. Alone he stood, comma, thumbs up and bright, exclamation unquote. Para 10. Technique of modern poetry. A first objection to quote modern unquote verse is that it is not verse because its prosody has no patterns of iambic or dactylic or other metrical units, but does what we know of verse justifies us in saying that absence of a conventional metrical pattern gives us prose and not verse, question mark. Page 378. If you recite, quote, modern, unquote, verse audibly, comma, you will notice that it certainly has a rhythmic freedom which a metrical pattern would not allow, and that its rhythm is simultaneously too restricted to be that of prose. Para. What emerges from a listening to the lines is the fact that their rhythm depends on the fall of an accent 3 or 4 times in each line. The position of the accent is not determined by any arrangement of metrical feet. In brief, the verse has a rhythm less planned than that of rhetoric, more limited than that of prose, and more regular than that of conversational English. We conclude that we have verse based on the fall of accent as many times in a line as the writer determines, and that the verse is based on rhythmical accentuation and not metrical accentuation. Listen to it in lines by T.S. Eliot which give an example so quiet as to do little more than make us notice something unusual in the metrical pattern. Stop, quote. The brown waves of fog toss up to me. Twisted faces from the bottom of the street, comma, and tear from a passerby with muddy skirts, an aimless smile that hovers in the air and vanishes along the level of the roofs, stop, closely allied to rhythm and and vanishes along the level of the roofs, stop, unquote, para. Closely allied to rhythm and rhyme is the diction of much contemporary verse which we feel is too ordinary to rank with. Quote, at the mid-hour of night, comma, when stars are weeping, comma, I fly. To the love vale where we loved, comma, when life shone warm in thine eye, ... The new diction is too stark, comma, too wanting in elusiveness, comma, to secure the effects of my heart aches, comma, and a drowsy numbness pains. My sense, comma, as though of hemlock I had drunk, comma, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains. 1 minute past, ... unquote, para. In appreciating the use of modern diction, we must remember that language can be either so bare as to be merely real life with poetic inspiration, or so artificial as to be too remote from life to have poetic significance. Stop.